Home. Good. Be seated, please. Home. Okay. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahaviryan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Very good. Welcome back. Welcome also to the many students attending these classes online. We continue with a new chapter today, chapter 23. I'll introduce it in just a moment. Last week we finished chapter 18, so we're taking a big jump from chapter 18 to 23, and let me explain why. We want first of all, you remember that I've said that the Uddhava Gita is quite long. It's twice as long as the Bhagavad Gita. And not all of the material is relevant to a student of Advaita Vedanta. So I've taken the liberty to choose only those chapters which would seem most relevant for us. Chapter 18 was wonderful. That was excellent. That story of the Brahmana from Avanti. Chapter 19 deals mostly with Sankhya philosophy. And to be honest, that's not terribly interesting for us. In fact, it's quite different from Advaita Vedanta, and it can cause some confusion for that reason, and also it's very philosophical. So we will skip chapter 19 and its teachings of Sankhya. Then chapter 20 is kind of an extension of the prior chapter. It deals with the three gunas. Now the three gunas are taught by both Vedanta and Sankhya. So you'd think that, well, in Advaita Vedanta, we also study the three gunas. I have to tell you, I found the chapter a little boring. We could study it, but I find in the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 14 is on the three gunas, and it is so much better than this chapter. Not that I don't want to sound critical, but if you want to understand the three gunas, I think it would be far better to study Bhagavad Gita chapter 14. Then chapter 21, which we're also skipping, is an interesting story about an ancient king called Pururavas. And Pururavas fell in love with Urvashi, the celestial nymph. Problem. So they were deeply in love. They had a bunch of children. Then she disappeared. And the rest of the chapter is Pururavas complaining about how miserable he is and criticizing romantic love. Now, the criticism of romantic love comes in Hindu scriptures in several places. For example, Bhartrahari's famous Vairagya Shatakam. Oh, don't read it before you get married. You get the point? And, it's likely that such subject matters are more intended for sannyasis and maybe to help them not worry about what they gave up. Anyway, I don't think it would be very relevant for us here. Then the following chapter, chapter 22, deals with puja in a highly ritualistic way. Lots of details about certain offerings that should or should not be made at the time of puja. And for those who are highly ritualistic, that would be a wonderful chapter. But I think, again, it's not tremendously relevant for us. When I was doing my preparation, after studying those chapters, I then came to chapter 23, the chapter we're starting today. I was so pleasantly surprised, especially after all those chapters, to have a chapter which was so clearly Vedantic, very powerful teachings, and in a fairly short chapter, wonderful chapter. In fact, I mentioned before that these chapters don't have names like chapters in the Bhagavad Gita have, but the commentator on this text, Sri Swami, calls this chapter Jnana Yoga. So very profound spiritual teachings in this chapter, and I think you will appreciate it a lot. Okay, can we have the slide, please? The slides that we use, my translation is available online on our website. If you want to use that, please do. All right, let's begin. Shri Bhagavanu Vacha, Shri Bhagavanu Vacha. Parasvabhava karmani, parasvabhava karmani, na prashanse na garhayet, na prashanse na garhayet, vishvamekatmakam pashyan, vishvamekatmakam pashyan, prakritya purushena cha, prakritya purushena cha. Starting the second line, na prashamset, you should not praise, na garhayet, or criticize. What should you not praise or criticize? First line, para swabhava karmani. The karmani, the actions which are performed by para, by others, according to their swabhava. You shouldn't praise or criticize the actions of others. Now, I know, at first I, what? Think about what the answer will come in just a moment. But this is a radical teaching. You shouldn't criticize or praise the actions of people. Well, many people do terrible things. Shouldn't we criticize them? Many people do wonderful things. Shouldn't we praise them? How about countries? Many countries today are engaged in terrible warfare. Shouldn't such countries be criticized? Well, Sri Krishna is going to give you an interesting observation, I should say, about praise and criticism. Here's what he says. He says that you shouldn't praise or criticize the actions of others done according to their nature, swabhava. Why? In the third line end, pashyan, seeing, understanding. Understanding what? Vishwam, the world, to be ekatmakam. The world has one nature. There's one kind of nature manifest in the world. What is that nature? He gives some details. Prakritya purushena cha. The nature of the world is twofold. One is prakriti, which actually means nature, and the other is purusha, which means consciousness. These are actually words used in Sankhya. Those two chapters we skipped over, 19 and 20, went into great detail about Purusha and Prakriti, which is Sankhya's names. By the way, it's also a dualistic system, which is why it's not helpful for those studying Advaita Vedanta to study in detail. But the point here is not the detail of Purusha and Prakriti, but rather nature, natural. The world, by definition, is natural. Agreed? Okay. The world, by definition, is natural. Beautiful sunny days are natural. Cloudy, rainy days are natural. Earthquakes are natural. Tsunamis are natural. Wildfires, most of them. Some are started by people, but most wildfires. Do you think wildfires only started when human beings existed? They've always existed. Lightning and other things will start wildfires. So the terrible fires burning in Los Angeles right now are natural. They're causing terrible harm, terrible damage, terrible suffering, but they are all natural. So you can't... Already in Los Angeles is finger pointing. Who is to blame? Everyone wants to put somebody is at fault. Not all. Obviously, if there's an earthquake or a tsunami, who will you point the finger at? It doesn't make sense, right? You don't say Ishvara is at fault. It is natural. Now, let's extend this. Tell me, is feeling hurt natural or unnatural? Is getting angry when someone hurts you, physically or emotionally, is getting angry natural or unnatural? Natural, right? Getting hurt, natural. Getting angry, natural. I'm not saying good. I'm not saying inevitable. I'm saying that it's something you should control. But think about children. Children are as natural as they come, right? A child gets hurt, child gets angry, and then the next thing that happens, I think the old comic book of two boys in the sandbox, and they each have shovels, and one boy hits the other one in the head with the shovel, and then that boy hits this one with a shovel, then this boy hits that one, and it keeps going on and on, back and forth. So which means hurt leads to anger, leads to retaliation, leads to more hurt, more anger, more retaliation. Is that scenario natural or unnatural? I'm not saying desirable. I'm not saying we can't do anything about it. But the topic here is nature, where he says, Vishwam ekatmakam. The world has one nature. So, there's a really important take-home message here. The person who hurt you so badly, they hurt you because they were angry, probably. Not necessarily, but probably, depending on how they hurt you. But suppose they were angry. Why did they get angry? They had their reasons, right? They were probably hurt or whatever. So tell me, the person who hurt you had anger. Was that anger natural or unnatural? Natural? The person who hurt you, look at the first line. Para swabhava karmani. Actions which are due to the swabhava, the nature of para, of the other person. The person who hurt you was naturally going to hurt you for thousands and thousands of reasons. Natural. It was natural. It was inevitable. I've given a metaphor for this before. If you're holding a child, an infant, or maybe a toddler in your arms, taking care of the toddler, and the toddler is agitated, swinging her arms around, suppose the toddler smacks you hard in the face. Hurts. Natural or unnatural? Your face was in the wrong place at the wrong time. You got smacked. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that person hurt you. I'm telling you, it is the same situation. Situation was much more complicated, absolutely. But the situation was as natural as the toddler smacking you in the face. Emotions are natural, right? Including, is jealousy natural? Envy? Frustration? Irritation? Have you noticed how some people just seem naturally obnoxious? Do you think they try to be obnoxious, or they read a book, How to Be Obnoxious? Come on. People are who they are. And if you are in the vicinity of somebody who is obnoxious or hurtful, you are going to get smacked figuratively. Now, this is not an argument for passivity. What does he say? Anything about what you should or should not do? The topic here is about praise and blame. We're not talking about what to do. You have to do something. That's a separate topic. We're not talking about that yet. We will talk. Well, let's talk about it now, since I brought it up. If the baby smacks, if that toddler smacks you, if I were holding that baby, that infant, I give it back to mom. I don't want to get smacked again. So the fact that somebody hurts you doesn't mean you allow yourself to be vulnerable to being hurt again and again and again. You have a dharmic responsibility to protect yourself. You have a dharmic responsibility to respond appropriately to every situation. But we're not talking about response here. We're talking about praise and blame. And look what happens. That person who hurts you, you go on saying, why did they do that? Failing to understand it was natural, failing to understand you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, like one's face, and you got smacked. And getting smacked by that person, figuratively, is natural. But if you don't understand that, and this is what Sri Krishna is teaching here, if you fail to understand that, then you go on blaming that person. After a month, you're blaming that person. You're still angry, you're still hurt. After a year, you're still angry and hurt. After 10 years, you might still be harboring that anger and hurt. Tell me, the anger and hurt and blame and resentment that you harbor in your heart for 10 years, how does that affect you? Interesting. How does it affect the other person? Not at all. But it affects you a lot. People say, oh, you have to forgive. What we're talking about now is the basis for forgiveness. All those self-help books that tell you to forgive those who hurt you, they rarely tell you how. Here, Sri Krishna is telling you how. And how to forgive the person who hurt you is to recognize the naturalness. Natural in the sense that according to the laws of nature, according to that person's nature. It says parasvabhava, according to that person's internal makeup, according to that person's life experiences, according to that person's karma, they hurt you. Means there's a lot of natural reasons for why that person hurt you. So when you hold on to all that resentment and anger and you go on saying, why did they do that? They shouldn't have done it. Suppose we flip that around. Suppose you really get this teaching and you understand the inevitability of getting hurt by that person in that given situation. This is so important. Again, doesn't mean you shouldn't do something about it. That's not our topic. Our topic is whoever hurt you did so for 1,000 reasons, all of which were natural. Even if that person really had an agenda to hurt you, tell me, is having such an agenda natural or unnatural? Depends on the person. For some people, that agenda was hurtful. Wow. I mean, having an agenda to hurt can be the result of one's life history. Let me illustrate it with a modern political example. We see this horrible, horrible violence going on in the Middle East, in Gaza in particular. So we see the Islamic militants hurting Israelis. We see the Israelis hurting Palestinians, and it's like the two boys in the sandbox. It's gone on for decades and decades. It's gone on for over 100 years. Yeah. So anyway, it's pretty bad. And if you ask what, so Israel. And look, Israel obviously has an agenda against, well, certainly against Islamic terrorists, Hamas. Many people would argue today they have an agenda against Palestinians. That's a highly charged topic. We won't take it up, but certainly they have an agenda against Hamas. So we'll keep it a little limited to that. And certainly Hamas has an agenda against Israel. Why? If you study the history of what happened, it's like the two boys in the box. They've been at it for a long time, generation after generation. Do you think that leads to an agenda? When a boy grows up in Gaza with bombs falling on his head, do you think that boy might grow up and have an agenda? When Israelis taking a bus to go to work are blown up on the bus, do you think that might cause an agenda for the Israelis? It works both ways. And now here, let's come back to the praise and blame. Who is to blame? Is Israel to blame? Is Hamas and other Islamic militants to blame? And if you study thoroughly the history of the Middle East, you'll find out neither of them are to blame. The cause of that whole mess, the fault is Great Britain and the UN. They're at fault. Study the history. It's Great Britain and the UN. Great Britain had this mandate and all of this. Anyway, let's not get into the history. You study that history. Just go and Google it and just learn a little bit. You'll find out that the decisions taken, the position, Britain, for some reason, very complicated. Britain took a Zionist position, and there's thousands of reasons not to justify it, but they took a Zionist position, and then the UN did nothing about it. That's what it is in brief. You go and study and you'll understand. So who shall we blame? Shall we blame Israel or shall we blame Palestine? Neither. Their fighting is natural. Again, doesn't mean we shouldn't do something about it. We're not talking about response. We're talking about praise and blame. So you can't praise or blame either of those actors. If you want to blame anyone, blame the UN, blame England. But today, though, who should be blamed is the international community for not intervening and stopping this terrible warfare. That is a huge lapse. The lack of effort in response to this carnage is a huge mistake. And how awful it is. There's no excuse for that kind of countries of the world can't figure it out. Anyway, you get the point about praise and blame, and that topic continues in the next verse. All right. Sri Krishna says, Parasvabhava karmani, Parasvabhava karmani, na prashamsati nindati, na prashyah nindati, saha shubhram shyate swartat, sa shubhram shyate swartat, asatyabhiniveshataha, asatyabhiniveshataha. So he starts off in the same theme, para swabhava karmani, the actions which are para swabhava, that are born, I don't like my translation here, the nature and actions of others. Anyway, sometimes I go fairly quickly when I do these translations. So, on further thought, I wouldn't translate it like that at all. The actions which are due to the swabhava, the nature of para, of another. That's a correct translation. This translation is not correct at all. So, what about that? Yaha prashamsati, one who praises the actions of others, and yaha nindati, one who criticizes the actions of another. What about that person? Saha, that person, ashu, immediately, bramshate swartat, will fall away from what they want, and what they want is happiness. That person loses happiness. When you go on hating or resenting the person who hurt you, what does that do to you? Bramshyate swartat. It interferes with your happiness, especially if you're stuck in the same room as that person and you have to see that person, or maybe you sit at a banquet table across from that person. Things like that happen. So you'll be miserable. Who is the cause of that misery? The hurt wasn't, if you understand the hurt was natural, then you have to admit that your unhappiness, because of being hurt a decade ago by someone or another, who is to fault for that after 10 years? Who is to fault for that unhappiness? You can't blame the other person, right? Especially not after 10 years. So you're at fault. It is our inability to, partly our inability to let go emotionally, that's a fact, but I think more significant, our inability to understand nature. Or my guru liked the expression, Ishvara's intelligent order. Everything happens according to Ishvara's intelligent order. Ishvara's intelligent order includes the laws of nature. Ishvara's intelligent order also includes the laws of karma. So based on the person's karma, based on the person's swabhava, inner makeup, that person hurt you. That is natural. That is occurring according to Ishvara's intelligent order. And if you fail to appreciate and understand that intelligent order of Ishvara, and if you hold on to your hurt and anger and resentment and frustration after 10 years, you and you alone are to blame for your unhappiness. So this is the point Sri Krishna is making here. And he's and now he gets a little bit philosophical. He says that the reason, this is how Sri Krishna explains your inability to let go after 10 years. He says the reason for that is asati abhiniveshataha. Abhinivesha is sometimes it gets translated as an addiction. That's too strong a word here. Some kind of, I've used the word fascination, something that draws your attention again and again and again is abhinivesha. Being focused on something, being mentally drawn to something is abhinivesha. And this abhinivesha, being drawn to something that is asati, unreal. So he says, the cause for your unhappiness after 10 years is your fixation. Oh, that's a good translation. Your fixation on asati, on something that's not real. Something that you have imagined in your mind, you've made a demon of that person. That person is not a demon. They did something demonic. Absolutely. They did something demonic. But the person is not a demon. But you have remembered that person as a demon, and you continue to demonize the person for 10 years. This is your fault. And this is interesting. Abhinivesha, the tendency for our minds to get drawn in such a way that it causes more trouble. I mean, there's a very important teaching. Give me a few minutes to bring it out. Think of a child with a scab. The scab hurts a little bit. So what does the kid do? Then it hurts more. You know, that seems so silly, but children do that. And not just children. Adults do it not with a physical scab, but with an emotional wound. Correct? That person who hurt you so badly, emotional wound. And what is your response to the emotional wound? Do you let it heal? This is self-defeating mental behavior. We perpetuate this hurt unnecessarily due to our lack of understanding. To use Sri Krishna's word, there is abhinivesha. There's a certain commitment in our minds towards asati, what is not real, and what is not real is your image of the person who hurt you as a demon. You've demonized the person, you've blown it way out of proportion, and as a result, you've held on to that hurt and resentment for 10 years. This has been going on for 10 years. You've prevented that wound from healing. I'd like to share, I had an interesting thought about how our minds get drawn into things which are not helpful, in fact, are hurtful. How about politics? So there are major changes coming in the political situation in our country. Some people are happy about it. Some people are intensely unhappy about it. That's natural or unnatural? Okay. It's completely natural. But here's the problem. Are you directly involved? We're involved when we go and vote. Or we're involved when we write a letter to your congressman or whatever, which is a great thing. But we're largely not involved on a day-to-day basis. But then, how many people who are not involved in politics on a day-to-day basis, they are following the politics not just day by day, hour by hour. You get these updates on your website, on your phone or whatever. You're getting all these updates. So this is abhinavesha. This is a fascination which does you no good and arguably is harmful. Again, so there are people who are really addicted to getting all this news. In fact, there are people who are addicted to news in general. Just to broaden this up, we're talking about abhinavesha. So somebody who is you watch all of this on the TV, they got all this stuff, what's happening in Washington, what's happening here and there, and then you get it on the internet, you get it on your phone. So you are like overwhelmed with all of this information about politics that leads to an addiction to news. And let me explain that. Think of if we lived 100 years ago, maybe a little more. If you lived, I think roughly 100 years ago, daily newspapers were catching on 100 years ago. Go back 200 years ago. So daily newspapers were not, they may have existed, but they weren't. They were probably like weekly gazettes or something 200 years ago. But certainly 100 years ago, weekly newspaper. So everyone is reading the newspaper. So that's once a day. And those newspapers were, 12 pages. What is if a modern newspaper, especially the weekend edition, like 300 pages. So anyway, 100 years ago, you had 12 pages of newsprint. And then, of course, that grew and grew and grew. And then, I made some notes here. Something you may not have thought about how significant it was. I think in the 1980s, cable TV and cable TV news, 24/7. Do you know that actually changed our culture? You may think of it as just something kind of trivial. A sociologist wouldn't call it trivial. An anthropologist wouldn't call it trivial. Culture changing. 24/7 news on cable. And that was in the 80s. And then a decade later came along the internet. And a decade or two after that came social media. And all of this leads to an addictive behavior with regard to news in general, and for some people, politics in particular. And obviously Sri Krishna is not talking directly about this, but he uses that word abhinavesha with regard to asati, things that are not real, things that are not important in your day-to-day life. So somebody who is addicted to political news gets all of this stuff. And how does it help them? I would argue it hurts them in two ways. One is their minds get sucked. I like the American expression. Their minds get sucked in. Their minds get sucked into all of this drama, and drama in the form of fighting, verbal violence. When your mind gets sucked into verbal violence, do you think that might affect your mind? Which is why the second problem is this person loves to argue about politics, and sometimes argue vehemently. This is unhealthy and unhelpful behavior. So I've given a very striking modern example, but it applies at every level. In other words, it applies with regard to that person who hurt you 10 years ago. When your mind keeps getting drawn back to that abhinavesha refers to how your mind gets drawn back again and again and again to experiences or things which hurt you. Every time you revisit that old event, you're perpetuating the harm it does. In the same way, to be immersed in politics perpetuates that. How many people are really angry and frustrated about politics? Lots, right? So I'm sorry for getting stuck here. What purpose does that serve, to be angry about what's happening in Washington, or to be happy about what he was talking about, praise and blame? What purpose does it serve to be rooting for your politician or to be hateful towards that politician? Anyway, I think for hopefully a mature person would see that Sri Krishna calls it asati. Not literally means not real, asat, not real, but in our context, not relevant, not helpful. So, should we immerse ourselves in things that are not relevant and not helpful, or should we withdraw our attention from things which are not relevant or not helpful? That's the point. Okay, let's continue. Taijase nidraya panne, taijase nidraya panne, pindasto nashta chetanaha, pindasto nashta chetanaha, mayam prapnoti mrityum va, mayam prapnoti mrityum va, tadvannanartha drikpuman, tadvannanartha drikpuman. In the second line, pindastaha, the one who abides in a pinda. What is a pinda? This lump of fat is a pinda. So, the jiva, an individual person, pindasta, abiding in the body. What about that person in the top line? Taijase apanne. Taijasa here refers to our indriya, senses. So taijase, when your senses, apanne, are withdrawn, nidraya, due to sleep. When your senses are withdrawn due to sleep is a fancy way of talking about dreams. Your senses are withdrawn, not your mind. Your mind is still very active in a dream, but you have no connection through your senses to the world around you. So, Taijase nidraya apane, when your senses are withdrawn in your dream, then what happens? Pindastaha, that one stuck inside this blob of fat, what happens to that person? Third line, prapnoti, gain, is immersed in mayam, in the illusion due to that dream. So, during a dream, you are immersed in maya, your own maya. This is a different kind of maya out here, but dream maya is of your own making, so you get immersed in that dream maya. On the other hand, pindastaha, that embodied person, jiva, when that person is, in the second line, nashta chetanaha. Chetana here refers to mind. When the mind is nashta, not exactly destroyed, resolved. We're talking about deep sleep. So the first line was talking about dream state. The second line is talking about deep sleep state, dreamless sleep. What about that person at that time? Prapnoti, the person is immersed in a state which is mrityumva. It's like death. Of course, it depending on your perspective, it's either like death or it's like bliss. For me, it's like bliss. For most people, it's like bliss. But some people might say, there are people who regret the fact that they spend 1/3 of their lives in bed. They say, I wish I'd never had to sleep so I could get more done each day. I don't feel that way at all. It's bliss. Blissful sleep. 1/3 of life is well spent in bed. So here, in the first part of this verse, Sri Krishna is talking about how in dream state you're immersed in Maya, and in deep sleep state you're immersed in nothingness, we'll call it. But then what about waking state? Well, last line he says, Tattvat, in the same way, Puman, a person in the waking state, is Nana Artadrik, is experiencing duality. Nana Artadrik, you experience duality. And here, we have to connect this to the next verse. So I'm going to go ahead in just a moment. But bear in mind that duality can be looked upon in two senses. In Vedanta, we generally use the term duality in a very philosophical sense. A philosophical sense of is there one or is there many? That in that philosophical sense. Do you know, though, that in biblical religions, they also use the word duality, but in biblical religions, they have a completely different meaning for duality. In biblical religion, duality means good and evil. That's what it means outside of the Hindu, Buddhist, Jain umbrella. In the rest of the world, duality means good and evil. And the reason for that has to do with our experience of good and bad. Have you noticed that when you have an experience, our tendency is to say, that's good, or that's bad. That's another kind of duality. So bear in mind that the word duality, nana, here means many. Nana drik, one who sees the world as being manifold, and in both senses. In the philosophical sense of duality, dvaita, also in this other sense of good and bad. Look at the next verse. Very interesting. Oops, there we are. Kim bhadram kim abhadram va, kim bhadram kim abhadram va, dvaitasya vastuna kiyata, dvaitasya vastuna kiyata, vachoditam tadanritam, vachoditam tadanritam manasadhyatameva cha manasadhyatameva cha. So, taking the second meaning of Dvaita, Sri Krishna asks here, and look at, start in the second line, Dvaitasya, for that duality which is avastunaha, there's a philosophical sense. It's not real. For this duality, Dvaitasya, which fundamentally is not real, this is a philosophical perspective of Advaita Vedanta, the clay is more real than pot. You have 100 pots, duality, one clay. So this is the philosophical non-duality. But notice Sri Krishna here isn't really talking about the philosophical philosophical duality, but that other kind, good and evil. So he says, Kim bhadram, what is good? Kim abhadram va, or what is not so good, what is bad? You know, it's highly subjective. You've heard me give the example before, this karela, this bitter gourd. Is it good or is it bad? Half of you will say good, half of you will say ick. If you get the point? How about this? Have you ever been in a room or an office place where somebody puts the temperature down really cold, the thermostat, and then you put it up a little warmer, and then they come back and they put it down colder? You have these thermostat fights because that person thinks cold is good, and you think it's not good. You're too cold. So the point here, and Sri Krishna is making this very common observation, that what we call good or bad, bhadram and abhadram, are completely personal, relative, okay? Completely dependent on you. And also kiyat, how good or how bad, how cold, how hot, how good is karela, how bad, whatever it is, there's a degree of goodness or badness associated with it. Well, this really is an underestimated problem, our tendency to categorize everything as good or bad. Think about the people you know, acquaintances. Friends, relatives, enemies. And there's some overlap between enemies and relatives. Sometimes. But we categorize friend and mitra and ari. Wait a minute, I thought people were natural. But we come along and arbitrarily categorize all of these people, and that's being rather judgmental, wouldn't you say? As soon as you categorize someone as friend, you tend to ignore their mistakes. And as soon as you categorize someone as Ari, you're like hypersensitive to their mistakes. That's being judgmental. We become judgmental towards people. We don't relate to people as they are. We relate to people through this filter, through this lens, this filter caused by this categorization as friend and enemy, as good and bad. And then Sri Krishna makes this very important observation. He says these categories of good or bad, the how good and how bad, he says all of this is vacha uditam. It is all described in words It is manasa dhyatam. It is understood through thoughts. So all of these, let me make the language a little bit more clear. All of these conceptions or conclusions about good and bad, these all are forms of thinking and expressions in the form of words. And the key point here is in the third line end, tat anritam. All of that is false. Good and bad are not universal categories. Mitra and Ari, friend and enemy, are not universal categories. They are our own personal opinions and nothing more. But do you know anyone, I'm being sarcastic here, do you know anyone who is highly opinionated? So, why would Sri Krishna, and we'll end with this point and pick this point up in the next class. He's not really, yes, there's a lot of psychology here, and it's wonderful to see that. We see that throughout the Bhagavad Gita, that a lot of very profound psychological observations. But the Bhagavad Gita is not a text on psychology, nor is the Uddhava Gita a text on psychology. It's wonderful that they have lots of relevant psychological teachings. But what Sri Krishna really wants to teach us is beyond psychology. So when he says this categorization into good and bad is anritam, it's false, he means it here not as I've just expressed it. I've given you a psychological perspective on that. But Sri Krishna's intent is not a psychological perspective, but a more fundamental perspective. And the more fundamental perspective is this. What we label good is that which we think helps us. That which we label friend is one who we think helps us. That which we label bad is that which we think hurts us. That which we label enemy is a person that we think can hurt us in one way or the other. Sri Krishna says such thinking and such words are anritam, wrong, false, incorrect, misguided. Why? Here's where Vedanta becomes extremely important. Tell me, if you really understand that your true nature is Satchidananda Atma, pure consciousness. The consciousness which, upon understanding fully, we all start off with a superficial understanding about the nature of consciousness. But if with the teachings of Vedanta you really, really get it, you'll discover that consciousness is the so-called inner divinity, that which is beyond worldly forms, that which is beyond, that which is transcendent. The word I've often used is unchanging. Consciousness is transcendent. It's not like anything else in the world. It's utterly unchanging. And here's the point, and this is where we will begin next week's class. The point is this: if your consciousness is transcendent, if your consciousness is unchanging, how can it be affected by anything good or anything bad? This is his point. If consciousness is truly transcendent, that so-called inner divinity, if consciousness is truly unchanging, as we've seen through the teachings of Vedanta, especially in our Sunday class. We go into this very deeply. If you've discovered that your consciousness is transcendent, your consciousness is unchanging, then good and bad become meaningless, since good means that which helps you, and bad means that which hurts you. Nothing can help you, nothing can hurt you. You already are that unchanging, divine, all-pervasive, full, limitless consciousness. You've always been that. So good and bad, friend and enemy, are words and ideas that have no real meaning. Of course, they have a meaning at a worldly level, but fundamentally, they are meaningless. Suppose we can come to appreciate that a little bit more, then what changes? Do you think you'll suddenly, if you've never liked Karela before, do you think you suddenly like it? I don't think that's going to happen. But when the person who hurt you 10 years ago hurts you again after 10 years, you might be a little bit more understanding. It might be completely different. There's a lot to be unpacked here. So we'll return to this point in the next class. Some announcements here. Very happy to announce that on Wednesday we are resuming our advanced meditation class. I think before pandemic, we used to have a meditation class. So it's meeting on the third Wednesday of each month. It means this coming Wednesday. It'll meet at 7 p.m. So if you already know more or less how to meditate, you are prepared for our advanced meditation, mostly Nididhyasana, Vedantic contemplation, so come and join us. Tomorrow, of course, we have our Vedanta class at 10 o'clock, followed by satsang, question answer, at 11. Please come and join us. We'll conclude with our prayers. Om Gananahan Tva Ganapatigam Avamahe Kaving Kavinam Upamashravastamam Jeshtarajam Brahmanam Brahmanaspatahanashranvan Utabasira Saranam Om Mahaganapataye Namaha Ishvaro Gururatmeti Murti Bheda Vibhagine Vyomavad Vyapta Dehaya Dakshina Murtaye Namaha Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsa Chanuramardanam Devaki Paramhanandam Krishnam Vande Jagadguru. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityor Ma Amritangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tat Sat.